In just 112 seconds, a broke 16-year-old boy quietly took 1 billion identities and then erased himself. October 17, 2021, 11:42 p.m. Riverside, California. A small, fading neighborhood tucked between an empty freeway and a dying strip mall. Rain hits the window like static against a broken screen. Inside a cramped, dim apartment, a single monitor glows blue. The camera would barely move, locked in place, like an investigator staring at a crime scene. No music, only the low hum of a secondhand server fan, and the soft, repeating rhythm of fast, disciplined keystrokes. Cold, precise, mechanical. We never see his face, just thin hands moving with a confidence you only see in people who grew up solving problems no one else cared about. At 11 hours, 42 minutes and 7 seconds, he triggers the first request. A quiet exploit slipping into a global single sign-on system, one used by banks, delivery apps, streaming services, government portals. A place designed to authenticate hundreds of millions of people every single day. At 11 hours, 42 minutes and 19 seconds, a misconfigured API answers him back. A crack in the armor. A debug endpoint never meant to be public. The kind of oversight that happens when a company grows too fast and tests too little. At 11 hours, 42 minutes and 56 seconds, the chain reaction begins. A token refresh vulnerability connects to a second flaw, then a third, then a fourth, like dominoes falling in the dark. And somewhere inside that cascade, a prohibited doorway opens. 1 billion identity files begin to flow out quietly, invisibly. Emails, phone numbers, device IDs, geolocation patterns, access tokens. 42,000 entries per second. Every line of data, a real human being who will never know the moment their digital life slipped away. All of it. Extracted on a $90 used laptop with a cracked hinge in a room with peeling paint. Wi-Fi borrowed from the neighbor downstairs. No high-tech rig, no criminal syndicate, no nation-state behind him. Just a hungry, isolated teenager who understood systems better than the people who built them. This wasn't supposed to be possible, not at this speed, not at this scale, not from a single child living below the poverty line. And yet, it happened. And what he did after stealing 1 billion identities, the part no agency, no analyst, no investigator could explain, is the reason his case remains one of the most disturbing digital disappearances in modern cybercrime. But what happened next changed everything. He was 16, legally still a kid, but already carrying the weight of a grown man's world. October 2021, Riverside County, California. A one-bedroom apartment with peeling walls, a flickering bulb, and an overdue electricity bill taped to the refrigerator door. Inside that room, a second-hand laptop sat on the floor, its screen scratched, its battery swollen. It was the only object he treated with any care. His name never mattered. What mattered was the environment that shaped him. He grew up at the bottom of the social ladder, not by choice, but by circumstance. At school, he was the quiet kid no one remembered, the one wearing the same hoodie for 3 years, the one teachers overlooked because he never caused trouble. Classmates whispered about the smell of cheap detergent on his clothes. Some avoided him. Most ignored him. He sat in the last row, always, head down, eyes buried in an outdated programming book he found in a thrift store for $2. While other students traded gossip and dreams, he studied loops and logic structures, alone. He wasn't antisocial by nature. He became that way because silence was easier than humiliation. Observers later described him as a ghost, barely present, barely noticed, moving through hallways like someone trying not to disturb the air around him. But behind that quiet exterior was a mind that absorbed everything. He remembered entire login flows after seeing them once. He could trace the logic of a system, the way some kids memorize a map of their favorite game. He watched people the way investigators watch suspects, silent, distant, analytical. And in the middle of that life was his mother, a woman working 2 part-time jobs, struggling with chronic illness, hospital visits, prescriptions that cost more than their monthly rent. By late 2020, unpaid medical bills had crossed $14,000. They received 3 collection notices in a single month. College was out of the question. Even graduation wasn't guaranteed. He spent afternoons repairing broken Chromebooks for neighbors, $15 per job. He spent nights at the public library until closing time, often forced out by security because he stayed too long in the computer section. Most teenagers learn code through online courses. He learned it by dissecting whatever source code he could find: public repos, old forums, abandoned school computers. By age 9, he wrote his first script. By 11, he could capture and analyze Wi-Fi traffic. By 13, he bypassed a school content filter using a tool he built himself, not out of rebellion, but curiosity. None of this made him dangerous. It made him capable. The turning point wasn't a grand moment. It was something painfully human. A teacher mocking his torn backpack. A classmate laughing at the stains on his notebook. A counselor telling him, "Kids like you don't end up in tech." Small cuts. But cuts that sink deep. And then came one insult too many, delivered in a crowded hallway, loud enough for everyone to hear. He didn't shout back, he didn't argue, he simply went silent, in a way that investigators later described as the switch moment. His motive wasn't destruction, not at first. He wanted money, enough to cover rent, hospital bills, basic survival. But humiliation twists intent. It corrodes judgment. It pushes quiet kids into darker corners of possibility. On the outside, nothing changed. He still walked home in the same hoodie, still ate the same microwave dinners, still fixed old laptops for cash. But on the inside, something had shifted. He stopped looking at systems as puzzles. He started seeing them as opportunities, and that was the moment, the exact psychological crossroads, when a silent, overlooked boy began drifting out of the light. That was when he took his first step, away from the world he knew. American documentary voiceover, cold, cinematic, analytical. He didn't target a small platform. He went after a digital empire. By early 2021, the company he focused on served more than 600 million daily logins, a global service provider operating out of major hubs: San Francisco, New York, Singapore, Frankfurt. Its single sign-on system linked hundreds of applications, banking dashboards, cloud storage, food delivery apps, workplace portals. A single identity unlocking an entire digital life. Behind the scenes, the architecture looked untouchable. Enterprise-grade firewalls, layered authentication clusters spread across multiple regions. A tiered API gateway designed to reject abnormal traffic patterns. Independent audits had once described it as virtually impenetrable. From the outside, it resembled a fortress, but from the inside, it resembled something more familiar to investigators: a sprawling, aging organism, powerful, fast, but full of unnoticed fractures. And those fractures begin small. The first was buried inside the OAuth refresh system, a timing flaw, a rare condition that appeared only under specific load. Documented years earlier in academic circles, but rarely seen in production. The second sat inside a forgotten API endpoint, a permissions check written for a development environment, never fully removed. A door meant to be locked, left ajar. Then there was the debug service, created for internal testing, never meant to face the public internet. But someone, at some point, deployed it with default configurations. Investigators later estimated it had been exposed for over 19 months before anyone noticed. Individually, none of these weaknesses were catastrophic, but chained together, they formed what cybersecurity analysts call a pivot path, a sequence of small missteps that create a large opportunity. And behind nearly every digital failure sits something older than code: human error. A junior engineer accidentally committed test credentials to a public repository. An administrator reused a password across internal tools, something security reports warn about every single year. And a former employee left the company without revoking an access token tied to a deprecated service. To the company, these were routine oversights. To a skilled observer, they were signals, subtle, scattered, but revealing where the armor had thinned. He wasn't the first to see them, but he was the first to understand how they connected. And in the cold logic of that realization, psychology becomes clear. He wasn't driven by vengeance at this stage. He was driven by recognition, an awareness that a system built to protect billions still depended on flawed people, imperfect processes, and aging code written under pressure. Every investigator knows this truth. Large systems fail quietly before they fail loudly. And in that silence, he found his way in. But every fortress has a crack. American documentary voiceover, cold, analytical, cinematic. He didn't improvise, he prepared 7 months, 212 nights, most ending at 3:08 a.m., the hour when the world around him finally went quiet, the hour his mind worked without interruption. Investigators later reconstructed this timeline from power logs, rotor resets, and fragments of activity left behind. What they found was not chaos, but method. A teenager building a roadmap with the patience of someone twice his age. His preparation began where most people never look: public information. He watched open repositories the company published for developers, not searching for secrets, searching for patterns, old functions, deprecated notes. Small inconsistencies that reveal how a large system really behaves under stress. At night, he observed the Wi-Fi traffic around his apartment complex, not to invade anyone's privacy, but to understand how signals moved, how latency shifted, how devices behaved under normal load. To him, this wasn't surveillance. It was science. He built his own simulation of the company's API structure on a $90 used laptop with a cracked shell and missing screws. It couldn't handle large data sets, so he fed it tiny samples, hundreds of them, each representing a different scenario, each revealing another subtle rule about how requests were processed. He analyzed logs from similar public services, maintenance schedules, outage reports, system behaviors during peak hours, not to break anything, but to understand how complex systems fail when no one is watching. And his tools reflected his life. Minimal, cheap, repurposed. A USB stick he bought from a gas station, a few text editors, a simple script he wrote himself to track behavioral anomalies, and a rented cloud instance paid with small amounts of cryptocurrency he earned repairing old laptops for neighbors. Nothing about this setup looked criminal. It looked like a kid trying to build something bigger than his circumstances, but preparation is rarely a straight line. He failed. A lot. Investigators counted 22 failed attempts to understand the system's refresh behavior. Each failure triggered rate limits. Each rate limit forced him to pause for hours. Sometimes an entire night of work collapsed with a single unexpected response. Once, his home router performed an automatic reset at 2:41 a.m., interrupting his connection mid-analysis. If anyone at the company had been looking at traffic that night, they might have noticed the anomaly. But they didn't, which meant he kept going. Failure didn't discourage him, it refined him. And that's the psychological red flag investigators always circle. Persistence without recognition, obsession without support, isolation becoming a feedback loop. As the months passed, his world shrank. Friends? None. Messages? Almost none. Human interaction? Only when necessary. The apartment grew darker. Curtains always closed. Lights off except for one flickering bulb in the hallway. The glow of the laptop became the room's only source of color. A cold, blue reflection on his face, turning his features into something hollow, almost unreal. People who later entered that room described it as frozen in time, as if its occupant had stopped participating in the outside world. This was no longer a hobby. It was his escape, his identity, his way out. Preparation, in his mind, wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about survival. It was about solving a problem the world had handed him without mercy. Poverty, pressure, and the constant fear of losing the only parent he had left. By month 7, the pattern was complete. He understood the system's behavior. He understood its blind spots. And more dangerously, he understood himself. And now, everything was ready. American documentary voiceover, cold, cinematic, analytical. Execution began in silence. No countdown, no drama. Just a 16-year-old in a dark room on a rainy night, finally putting 7 months of obsessive preparation into motion. Investigators reconstructed the moment through timestamps, memory artifacts, and network traces scattered across 3 continents. What they uncovered was a sequence so fast, so controlled that even seasoned analysts described it as emotionless efficiency. 0 o'clock. He sends the first request. A quiet probe that looked identical to routine traffic. Nothing loud, nothing suspicious. Just one more packet, a global ocean of requests. 007. A server responds with something unusual, not a full access point, just a subtle inconsistency, one that confirmed everything he had mapped for months. To an untrained eye, it was noise. To him, it was signal. 014. He pivots, not by force, not by breaking through walls, but by following the system's own logic, its overlooked paths, its forgotten internal behaviors. He slips into a debugging service still active behind the main authentication framework. A service never intended for external interaction. 037. A master-level credential appears. Not the kind that grants absolute power, but the kind that opens the next door in a chain the system no longer remembers building. From here, the extraction wasn't a smash and grab. It was controlled navigation. He layered requests in a way investigators later called API chaining. Small steps, incremental queries, each one designed to resemble normal user activity, each one blending into the background noise of a platform processing tens of millions of events per minute. He disguised his traffic as routine updates. No spikes, no patterns, no alerts. He spread the path across 3 different regions, then routed the flow across nodes in Canada, Sweden, and Chile. To any monitoring system, it looked like harmless international latency. He also broke the process into micro-requests, a strategy analysts often see in fraud investigations. Small actions that avoid thresholds, small shadows that avoid detection. Inside the room, tension built quietly. The laptop's CPU climbed above its normal temperature. The cooling fan rattled, a metallic, uneven hum that investigators later measured at nearly 58 decibels, loud enough to drown out the rain outside. But he didn't flinch, didn't blink. His eyes locked on scrolling strings of metadata, flickering across a cracked display. Rain hit the window harder. Wind pushed against the thin frame. In any other home, these sounds would feel calming. In his room, they became part of the rhythm, a cold soundtrack to a silent operation. And then, the moment that would change his life and millions of others arrived. Rows of data accelerated, token structures, metadata clusters, identity fragments moving at a speed no single laptop should have handled. Investigators estimated the flow at 40,000 entries per second, a rate the system itself never anticipated. Then the line appeared. A simple string of text, no color, no flourish. 1 billion entries exported, 1 billion identities extracted in minutes, seen by only one person. He didn't celebrate, he didn't speak. Witnesses who later analyzed the room said the silence was the most unnerving part, as if he had expected this outcome from the very beginning, and just when everything seemed stable. Just when the timeline suggested he was ready to pull back, something shifted. A server log spiked, a monitoring script woke up, and a single anomaly appeared deep inside the company's internal telemetry. It wasn't enough to identify him, but it was enough to change the trajectory of the night. And then, the unexpected happened. American documentary, voiceover cold, cinematic, analytical. For 7 months, everything moved in silence, but silence is fragile, and on the night he reached 1 billion identities, it finally broke. It started with a flicker deep inside the company's monitoring stack, an anomaly so small it should have drowned in the noise. But at 1:17 a.m., the system automatically shifted into internal alert mode. A spike, barely measurable, but out of pattern. The kind of deviation modern platforms are trained to notice. In a glass-walled office, 400 miles away, a night shift engineer watched dashboards scroll by. He had seen outages, bugs, even minor intrusions, but never this combination of signals, elevated request chains, unexpected token refresh behavior, and a user flow that didn't match any standard geographic path. He leaned forward, adjusted his chair, zoomed in on the logs, and for the first time, someone on the inside was looking directly at the trail the boy had created. A trail he had worked months to keep invisible. Within seconds, the engineer escalated the alert. Security teams were notified. Automatic containment protocols kicked in. Endpoints began shutting down one by one, quietly sealing doors the boy had slipped through only minutes before. Inside his dim apartment, he felt the shift. Not through alarms or warnings, but through behavior. Requests delayed by fractions of a second. A response header slightly out of place. A subtle hesitation in a system that had never hesitated before. To most people, it would have meant nothing. To him, it meant danger. He had less than 3 seconds before internal tracing tools could begin reconstructing the path. Less than one mistake before the session collapsed and revealed the origin point. Psychologists call this moment cognitive compression, when a stressed mind narrows its focus into a single, precise action. He didn't panic, he didn't freeze, he executed, not an attack, a retreat. He deleted his temporary scripts, every fragment, every log, every clue that could hint at intent. He closed running processes before the system could record them, not by force, but by shutting them down in a way that produced no meaningful telemetry. Then he triggered something investigators found chilling, a personal kill switch written months earlier, designed not to harm the system, but to erase his own footprint. It didn't destroy data, it simply cut the connection in a clean, untraceable pattern, the digital equivalent of walking out of a room without leaving a shadow. But he wasn't done. He removed the SIM card he had used as a fallback connection, broke it in half, and dropped it into a cup of water, a crude but effective way of ensuring nothing readable remained. Then he pulled the plug, not a soft shutdown, not a graceful exit, a hard physical cutoff, the kind investigators later called a vanishing point, a moment where the technical trail collapses into nothing. The screen went black, the fan spun down, the room returned to stillness, and somewhere, miles away, an engineer watched the last abnormal log entry freeze, and then disappear. The company knew something had happened, but they had no suspect, no source, no direction. The path had ended before it began. Somehow, he survived the moment. American documentary voiceover, cold cinematic analytical. The impact wasn't immediate. It unfolded like a slow-moving shockwave, starting in one server cluster, then rippling across the globe. By dawn on October 18th, 2021, the numbers were undeniable. A full 1 billion user records had been accessed in a window small enough to be overlooked, yet large enough to destabilize digital trust worldwide. Companies issued emergency statements. Media outlets used phrases no corporation ever wants to see: unprecedented breach, global security failure, systemic identity exposure. Governments moved quickly. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency activated a joint task force. Europol launched a parallel investigation out of The Hague. Multiple intelligence groups quietly reached out to one another, sharing fragments of signal data and log correlations. Within 48 hours, the breach became the largest identity exposure in modern history. And the hunt began. Teams from FBI Cyber Division, Europol's EC3, and several national security units across Asia and South America attempted to trace the event. They combed through logs spanning 3 countries: Canada, Sweden, Chile. The same 3 points his traffic had briefly touched, but every route ended in the same place: a dead node, a disconnected endpoint, a timestamp that led nowhere. Investigators later described the trail as evaporated, not wiped, not sabotaged, just gone. That absence created a new problem: speculation. Some analysts projected the breach as the work of a state-backed group, a coordinated intelligence operation with months of planning. Others insisted it had the signature of a sophisticated cyber-criminal syndicate.
It's isolated,
A few
but it's
believed
not.
it was a retaliatory strike, the kind carried out by hacktivist collectives during moments of global tension. No one mentioned a teenager. Not one report entertained the idea. Meanwhile, the numbers worsened. Banks froze accounts across multiple regions. Payment apps flagged millions of transactions for review. Insurance companies reported spikes in identity theft claims. Economists estimated the financial damage would eventually exceed $6 billion in direct losses and far more in indirect fallout. But the most devastating cost wasn't money. It was trust. A platform once considered invincible had been breached from the inside out. Users questioned whether their digital lives were ever safe to begin with. Share prices fell. Government oversight intensified, and the company itself entered a crisis it would struggle to recover from. But while investigators, analysts, and agencies chased phantoms, the real phantom was disappearing. When authorities finally reached his apartment, the scene was unsettling in its simplicity. A small room, bare walls, a mattress without sheets, a desk covered in dust rings where a laptop used to sit. No notes, no devices, no drives, no trace of activity, digital or physical. Even the router logs showed only normal usage, as if the months of late-night work had never happened. To investigators, it was less a home, and more an abandoned shell. He was gone, not hiding, not running, just removed, the way a file is removed from a system. And for the first time since the breach, agencies realized they weren't dealing with a group or a state or a syndicate. They were dealing with someone who understood how to vanish long before anyone started looking. But the story wasn't over. American documentary voiceover, cold, cinematic, analytical. When the dust settled, investigators expected at least something. A remnant, a trace, one misplaced byte of data that slipped through the cracks. They found nothing. No exported files, no hidden tokens, no cached metadata, not even the digital debris that usually survives deep deletion. Forensic teams described the scene as mathematically empty, a footprint so clean it felt unnatural. Years of cybercrime investigations had taught them one universal truth: every action leaves residue, a log, a timestamp, a memory fragment. But here, the trail simply ended, as if someone had closed a door and removed the entire hallway behind it. And in that vacuum, rumors grew. Some analysts believed he had erased himself on purpose, not just wiping devices, but systematically removing every digital breadcrumb that tied him to the world he grew up in. Others insisted he was living under a new identity somewhere, a borrowed name, a prepaid device, a quiet existence far from the noise he created. A darker theory suggested he had slipped into the invisible corners of the internet, places where people don't vanish physically, but vanish digitally, living without trace, without record, without expectation of being found. For a long time, there was nothing. No new activity, no suspicious signals, no hints. Then, 3 years later, something surfaced. Inside an old diagnostic server still running on outdated hardware, a single log entry appeared during a scheduled maintenance check in March 2024, a line of text. Small, unremarkable, but chilling in context. Ghost.local, signed out permanently. The timestamp matched no known event. The username matched no known account. And the signature didn't align with any active system. It was as if someone, somewhere, wanted the world to know one thing: the final exit had already happened. And that left investigators with the question no database could answer. Can a broke 16-year-old truly erase himself from the digital world? Even now, no one can say. Cases like this don't close. They fade, slowly, quietly, until all that remains is theory. And in the end, as one analyst said, some truths are not lost. They simply choose not to be found. Or maybe the truth disappeared with him.